Today I'm going to try to answer a seemingly simple question. What is piracy? In today's world, our biggest issues are global issues. Think of climate change, think of the financial crisis. Those are terrible issues. But at least there is something reassuring about them, is that we have theories that can help us understand those issues. So we have climatology that can speak to climate change. We have economic theory that can speak to the financial crisis. And yet, despite the fact that piracy has become a global issue, well, we do not have a theory of piracy. What we have, though, is a definition of piracy. We have a very authoritative definition of piracy that has been brought to us by the United Nations. According to the United Nations, a pirate is someone who commits illegal acts of violence or depredation for private ends on the high seas. Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward definition. These guys are pirates according to the definition. They are robbing other people on a ship on the high seas. Okay, that's easy peasy. Now, this guy is not a pirate. Okay, he's robbing other people, but he's not on a ship, he's not on the high seas, he's in a bank. Under his feet, there is no water, there is no high sea, just a hardwood floor, okay? So easy peasy, this guy is not a pirate. Now, what that means is that holding someone at gunpoint does not automatically make you a pirate. It will make you a pirate on the sea, but it will make you a thief on land. Now, think about it. It means that what really matters here is not what you do, but where you do it, okay? Piracy is about location. It is about the territory. Now, let me introduce you to this guy. This guy is called Henry Morgan. He was one of the most famous pirates in the 17th century. But this guy at the time was not called a pirate. He was called a privateer or a corsair. Why? Because he was actually working for the King of England. The King of England had hired him and authorized him to rob as many ships as he wanted to. Okay? So this guy was not considered a pirate because he was not committing illegal acts of violence on the high seas. It was all legal because he was supported by a government. Now, piracy is a little bit more complex than what it first seemed. But here today I'm with you, and I feel safe. There's no water around here. I feel like I'm in a safe harbor, and even if I decided to rob you guys at the end of my talk, that wouldn't make me a pirate. Okay, so I might as well take off this ridiculous eye patch that I'm wearing because I'm not gonna need it today, obviously. And I can finally see you. You guys look great. Okay, so piracy is a little bit more complicated than it seems, and based on the story of Henry Morgan, here's the first takeaway for you guys. If you're considering making a career of robbing ships on the high seas, first you need to find at least one government out there that's going to tell you that it's okay to do so. That way you won't be called a pirate. Now, things get a little bit more complicated when we look at those different phenomena. Pirate radio, online piracy, biopiracy. We use those terms, okay? We have some common understanding of what they mean, but it's a very vague understanding, and that's quite understandable because there is no definition nowhere for those terms, not in the United Nations Charter, not anywhere else. Now, why should we care? I think we should care because piracy has become a pervasive phenomenon, okay? Everyone seems willing to go thermonuclear war on the issue of piracy today. Businesses, governments, advocacy groups, activists, and of course, lawyers. These people are staunch supporters of cracking down on piracy, or they are pro-piracy, and they're very loud about all this, but if you ask them, really, what do you mean when you say piracy? What is the connection between looting a ship's cargo on the sea and making a copy of a digital file in cyberspace? then even the loudest activists will become very silent at once, because it's actually quite understandable we do not have a proper definition of piracy. Now, I think this is a huge problem. I think this is a huge problem because it creates opportunities for multiple parties with vested interests to frame the debate around piracy in whatever direction serves their interest the best. And I don't like that. Now, don't put your hopes too high. Today I am not going to tell you whether piracy is a good thing or a bad thing, okay? In fact, as you might have heard already, I come from France, and I would never tell you whether I like or dislike a particular wine before I've tasted it. Okay, I want to know what's in the bottle. And so I try lots of wine, and then I decide to buy them or not, and that way I can get to drink a lot of free wine. I know you guys in North America are dreaming of free beer. I drink of free wine, okay? So today what I'm going to try to do for you is open the piracy bottle so you can see what's inside for yourself. And to do that, I'm going to show you a short documentary that I produced. It's directed by Daniel Wyatt. It's available on YouTube under a Creative Commons license with subtitles in 15 different languages. And as you will see, it's a little bit provocative, but now I'm going to show you the movie, and I'll be back in 5.
SOPA was a bill to give the US government the right to block access to any website it deemed to be in breach of copyright law. Opposing this American plan to create a state cyber police were such online platforms as Anonymous, Wikipedia, Reddit, 4chan, and DeviantArt. Many governments see cyberspace as a sovereign territory that should be under state control. But to organizations like Anonymous, cyberspace is a public good that cannot be owned or centrally controlled. Acts of piracy have always been a response to the control of uncharted capitalist frontiers. Piracy is not a random act. It is predictable and lies at the core of capitalism. The conflict over the control of cyberspace is just the latest in a long history of struggles. It all began in the 17th century when capitalism expanded into the first uncharted territory, the high seas. The European states were competing for ownership of trade routes. To impose their own rules, they created monopolies called the East India Companies. The Dutch version, known as the VOC, was designed to rule over the trade routes the Dutch had discovered. For the Dutch, both competing companies and indigenous merchants were considered pirates. But why? From the state's point of view, anyone not respecting the standards imposed by the ruler is a pirate. So piracy is a matter of perspective, and those in power tend to impose their own perspective on the rest of the world. That's why the Dutch government saw nothing wrong when in 1603 a Dutch admiral attacked a Portuguese ship along the spice route. In fact, the Dutch government had sanctioned the attack by providing a letter of marque and reprisal. Those given this authority were known as privateers or corsairs. So what the Portuguese considered an act of piracy was, for the Dutch, a valiant move in forcing control of a sea route they claimed to own. Many pirates believed the high seas to be a public good, to be used freely for the benefit of everyone. But in uncharted territories, it is unclear who the legitimate owners are and who the pirates are. Stories of pirates are not unique to Hollywood tales of a bygone era. History repeats itself whenever capitalism expands into uncharted territory, and that includes cyber and outer space. So Johnny Depp won't be out of work anytime soon. In the early 20th century, the British government created a monopoly to enforce rules in the latest capitalist territory, the airwaves, and the BBC was born. Its purpose was to create rules for programmers and for listeners, such as allowing only religious shows and classical music. His Majesty's subjects were to listen to the broadcasts in silence, using only BBC-approved receivers. But the popularity of offshore pirate radio made the government rethink the rules of broadcasting. And since the end of the BBC's monopoly in 1967, the airwaves have been free of censorship and treated as a public good. The funny thing is, every time capitalism expands into new territories, state monopolies are used to define the rules and gain control. Or did you actually believe that capitalism and free markets were one and the same thing? Today, the issue of net neutrality in cyberspace echoes the struggles for freedom of the seas and freedom of the airwaves. Remember the Dutch corsairs attacking the Portuguese ship? Well, in 2001, the Chinese government authorized 10,000 cyber pirates turned cyber corsairs to attack American targets in reprisal for a US drone intrusion. Since then, both the US and China have been tracking cyber pirates online to offer them jobs as cyber corsairs. Using cyber weapons such as the Stuxnet and flame viruses, cyber corsairs fight for control over cyberspace, a strategic territory on which so many industries depend. So ask yourself, who shall we trust to control cyberspace? A for-profit like Google, sometimes backed by the NSA? A non-profit like ICANN, supported by the US government? Or a collective of stateless cyber activists like Anonymous? Clearly, we owe multiple pirate organizations for their view of the sea as a common good, for unleashing free radio broadcasting, and for defending net neutrality. Some say that sea pirates were the only ones accepting women on board in the 17th century. Thank you, guys. But the story is not over. Capitalism has entered a new age of expansion, and gene maps and outer space are the new uncharted territories of the 21st century. Who will you trust to control them?
Okay, so let me try to summarize what we've just seen. To obtain piracy, you need 4 things. First, you need uncharted territory. Uncharted territory is a territory about which there is no consensual rules defining what is legal and what is legitimate. Then you need states that compete for control over this territory using monopolistic organizations that seek to achieve territorial enclosure. Okay, when these 4 conditions are met, then you get piracy. So that brings us to a definition of piracy. Piracy in uncharted territory happens when pirates contest centralized control by states and their monopolies. And what they do usually is they suggest alternative rules emphasizing openness, free circulation, and last but not least, the notion of the common good. And this is very important because even though pirate organizations are illegal, what they do is considered legitimate when they defend the common good. When they claim to defend the common good, they receive a lot of support from the civil society. Okay, so there is this tension between illegality and legitimate action. Now, you must think, this guy is crazy. First, he shows up on the stage with an eye patch. And then second, he's been rambling about piracy for 10 minutes, and he hasn't pronounced a single time the word copyright. Well, actually I did. You guys were not paying attention. Copyrights and patents are nothing but particular instances of monopoly. Now, on the screen behind me, you see a bunch of organizations that are all considered piratical according to the definition that I just gave you. So for instance, DIY Bio is a decentralized organization that considers that genetic material should be a common good. And so they fight monopolistic appropriation of genetic sequences by governments or private corporations that try to do that using patents. Okay, now let me give you an example of people that wouldn't be considered pirates according to that definition, and that's probably gonna surprise you. The so-called Somali pirates, I wouldn't consider them to be pirates. Not anymore, not today. And the reason why is because today the high seas are not uncharted anymore. Actually, they ceased to be uncharted on the day all the governments in the world agreed to ratify the UN Charter that I showed you before, and on that day they all adopted the same perspective. They all recognized the international waters as a common good for the first time in history. And so from that point onwards, there is no distinction between privateers and pirates anymore on the high seas. there's only thieves and criminals. Now, it doesn't mean that establishing supranational guidelines is a good way of dealing with piracy. I'm going to show you a quote by a very famous pirate that would probably agree with that idea. Kim.com. Kim.com, in a recent interview, said that privacy, according to the United Nations Charter, is a basic human right, and he's asking how is that being respected by governments. Okay? So what Kim.com is doing here is that he is invoking the common good as embodied by this United Nations Charter against the self-interest of any particular government or any particular industry, and he considers that cyberspace should be considered a common good, just like the high seas. Now, is piracy a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not going to answer that question today. In fact, next year I'm going to be teaching a course on piracy for the first time, and if I gave you the answer today, I know my students would look it up on YouTube, and then there would be no point teaching the course anymore. So hopefully today I managed to open the piracy bottle for you so you could get a taste of what's inside, and you can now make an opinion for yourselves, because hopefully I managed to provide you with a definition of piracy and maybe even the outline of a theory of piracy. Thanks so much for your attention.